Welcome to Quiet Universe, where we explore the mysteries and possibilities of worlds just beyond our imagination. Today, we're diving into a scenario that's both terrifying and fascinating to listen to. What if it started raining and never stopped? From the first gentle drops to endless, relentless downpour, we'll explore how the world around us changes at key moments, day by day, week by week, and eventually across years and decades. But this isn't just about watching water fall from the sky. We'll see how nature and human civilization respond to the overwhelming power of water, covering everything from rivers and lakes swelling beyond control to farmlands drowning under endless rain. We'll explore the collapse of transportation and infrastructure, the struggle for survival in urban areas, the silent destruction of forests, and the impact on ecosystems, wildlife, and human health. At every step, the rain reshapes the world, pushing people to adapt or collapse, transforming landscapes into waterlogged ruins, and leaving behind a planet unrecognizable from the one we know. Get ready to journey through time and see how a never-ending storm would unravel the threads of life as we know it, with each passing day bringing new challenges, surprises, and consequences. Let's begin and see what happens on the first day of eternal rain. Day 1. On the first day, when the rain starts, it might seem like any other storm rolling through. You'd look out your window and see the streets getting wet, maybe some people rushing with their umbrellas, the normal reaction to a rainy day. But as the hours drag on and the rain doesn't ease up, subtle changes begin to ripple across everything around you. The rivers and lakes start to swell, gently at first, and the water level inches upward. What would normally take weeks for a reservoir to fill happens in just a day, though it might not be alarming yet. The rainwater flows into these bodies faster than expected, creating a delicate tension between nature's limits and the ever-pouring sky. In the fields, the farmers might start to worry. Crops need water, sure, but too much in a short time spells trouble. You'd see waterlogging in low-lying farmlands, roots submerged in a soggy mess, plants gasping for air as the soil struggles to drain. The delicate balance of moisture needed to nourish the earth teeters dangerously. By evening, farmers might begin covering crops or trying to divert water in a desperate attempt to save them from drowning. The roads, at first, would look manageable. Cars splashing through puddles, windshield wipers working overtime. But as rainwater accumulates, it becomes harder for the drains to keep up, and soon the roads are slick and increasingly difficult to navigate. Minor flooding might cause delays or force people to detour around waterclogged intersections. Traffic slows, and accidents become more frequent as visibility worsens. Anyone relying on public transport starts to notice buses running late or getting stuck in pockets of deepening water. Meanwhile, the infrastructure, though built to withstand storms, starts showing the first signs of strain. Bridges and overpasses bear the weight of the rising water levels. Construction sites pause, their foundations softening under the constant rain. Workers on tall buildings can't continue with slippery surfaces, while basements and underground structures begin to fill. On the outside, buildings stand tall, seemingly untouched, but deep inside, water creeps into places it's not supposed to be. Flooding is usually a slow disaster, but with no break in the rain, the water seeps into homes, basements, and businesses. Those living in low-lying areas would quickly find themselves dealing with water trickling in. The emergency services might not be overwhelmed yet, but they'd be getting more calls as people realize they're facing a situation beyond an ordinary downpour. For those near the mountains or steep hills, landslides become a growing fear. The steady rain loosens the soil, and though nothing catastrophic happens on day 1, there are warnings and the unmistakable sense that something is shifting under the surface. A few small landslides may occur, blocking rural roads or damaging properties built on unstable ground. But it's the quiet signs that something bigger could be looming that start to unsettle people. The water supply systems, oddly enough, are paradoxically at risk. While you'd think all this rain would mean plenty of fresh water, it's not that simple. Rainfall can overwhelm water treatment plants, leading to potential contamination. The sheer volume of water can cause runoff to pick up pollutants, pesticides from farmlands, and other debris, threatening the very water we rely on to be clean and drinkable. In terms of power generation, hydroelectric plants might initially benefit from the higher water flow, but as rivers rise too quickly, operators could be forced to release excess water to prevent damage to the dams, risking localized flooding downstream. Wind and solar power would face their own issues. Solar panels, obscured by the endless clouds, would be far less efficient, and the stormy weather could interfere with wind turbines, putting strain on an already taxed energy grid. For wildlife, the animals are probably more aware than humans that something unusual is happening. The constant rain forces many to seek higher ground. Birds struggle to find shelter, their nests becoming sodden, and smaller creatures, especially those reliant on burrows, are in immediate danger of losing their homes. The habitats that normally provide a delicate balance for these animals start becoming unlivable. As the soil becomes saturated, erosion kicks in quicker than expected. In rural areas, fields start to lose their topsoil, and in the city, it's more subtle, with parks and green spaces becoming muddy, but the slow erosion of the landscape begins, imperceptible to most on the first day. For people in housing developments or urban areas, the situation is still manageable but tense. Some might notice leaks in their roofs, and anyone living in older buildings would likely start thinking about repairs they put off. But the real worry is the rainwater that can't be diverted, the gutters that overflow, and the water that begins pooling around the edges of buildings, threatening to seep inside. Drainage systems, designed to handle the usual rainfall, struggle with the nonstop deluge. They're meant for bursts of rain, not for hours on end without respite. By late afternoon, you'd see them begin to fail, and water would start collecting in streets and parking lots. The backlog in the system would create miniature floods across the city. Crews working on drainage would find themselves behind schedule, unable to keep pace with the sheer volume. The impact on human health might not be obvious yet, but on the first day, people with respiratory issues would feel the effects of the humidity rising, and those in flood-prone areas might face the anxiety and stress of knowing that their homes could soon be underwater. There's also the looming threat of waterborne diseases if the situation continues. Communication networks remain mostly intact for now, but they're not impervious to the weather. The constant rain would begin causing static and interruptions in some areas, especially in regions where satellite dishes are the norm. Cell towers might get overwhelmed, and power outages in local areas could disrupt services. Coastal regions, however, would start seeing immediate changes. As rivers feed into the oceans, tides would rise faster than usual. Coastal erosion would become a real and present danger, though the real destruction might still be days away. People living near the coast might feel the unease that comes with rising water levels, knowing that their homes and livelihoods could soon be at risk. Tourism would come to a halt, of course. On the first day, outdoor activities would be canceled, beaches closed, and scenic spots deserted. Hotels and travel businesses might shrug it off at first as a bad weather day, but the calls for cancellations would start coming in. Vacationers trapped in a rain-soaked city would begin to grow restless, wondering how long this could last. The global economy wouldn't feel the effects immediately, but shipping routes could see their first disruptions as the heavy rain interferes with transportation. Delays begin, though on day one it's just a minor hiccup. Stock markets and business operations remain stable, but whispers of concern would start spreading, especially among those whose industries rely on stable weather patterns. Weather patterns themselves would begin shifting in response to the massive influx of moisture into the atmosphere. Meteorologists would watch their screens with a growing sense of alarm as they track what looks like an endless cycle of rain. The jet stream might wobble, and what was initially a local or regional storm starts to affect neighboring areas, sending ripples through global climate systems. Forests, like everything else, don't appear immediately affected, but the roots of trees would already be soaking up more water than they need. In dense, wet forests, this might not be a problem right away, but the risk of root rot, fungal infections, and trees becoming waterlogged would become a long-term concern if the rain keeps falling. Ecosystems as a whole would experience the beginnings of an imbalance. Water, the lifeblood of life, is now in overabundance, and that abundance quickly turns from blessing to burden. The delicate harmony between species, their habitats, and their food sources would start to break down. Day one is just the beginning, a quiet but significant shift in how the natural world handles this unprecedented event. It's a reminder that nothing in nature exists in isolation, and the rain touches everything, leaving no part of life unaffected. Day 2. By day 2, the relentless rain has long since lost its novelty. It's no longer the light drizzle people can shrug off with a hood or umbrella. Now it's a constant downpour that's beginning to take its toll in more ways than anyone expected. The rivers and lakes that seemed to handle the first day's rain are now undeniably swollen. Water rushes faster and more violently through riverbeds, eroding banks that were stable just 24 hours ago. Lakes brim to their edges, with low-lying areas around them starting to flood. People living near these bodies of water are getting nervous, especially as local authorities issue warnings of potential evacuations. The farmland is a different kind of tragedy. Fields have turned into mud pits. Crops that could withstand a day of rain now suffer from too much water. The roots are suffocating in the drenched soil, and by the second day, the damage is becoming irreversible for some plants. Farmers, once hopeful that their yields could recover, begin to face the bitter reality that they might lose entire sections of their crops. The rain no longer just disrupts planting or harvesting schedules, it's devastating livelihoods. The wet soil attracts pests and disease, worsening the already grim picture. In the cities, transportation grinds to a near halt. Streets that were merely soaked the day before are now flooded, making it impossible for cars and buses to pass. Public transit systems are overwhelmed with delays, and many routes have been suspended altogether. People who managed to get to work the previous day are now stranded, faced with rising water levels and roads that no longer seem safe. Emergency vehicles struggle to navigate the flooded streets, with response times growing longer by the hour. People stuck in traffic, or worse, in their homes, grow anxious as the situation deteriorates rapidly. Infrastructure, already under strain, is now showing cracks. Roadways buckle under the weight of standing water, potholes deepen and widen, and sections of highways begin to wash away. In some areas, bridges close as officials fear they might collapse under the increased pressure from rising rivers below. Construction projects are abandoned altogether, leaving half-finished buildings exposed to the elements. For cities that rely on tunnels or underground transport, there is a growing fear that those systems may soon be compromised by water, creating a ticking time bomb of potential flooding in places that were never meant to handle this much rain. Flooding, once localized to the most vulnerable areas, has now spread. Entire neighborhoods are underwater, and those living in basements or ground floors begin scrambling to move whatever they can to higher ground. You can feel the collective tension in communities as sandbags are stacked and pumps work overtime. Yet the water keeps rising. People are tired, physically and emotionally. The rain has started to become more than an inconvenience. It's an unrelenting force, and they're beginning to realize they have no control over what's happening. In mountainous regions, the rain has loosened the ground further, and small landslides from day one have given way to more serious collapses. Hillsides that once seemed stable give way under the relentless water, sending mud, rocks, and debris crashing onto roads, homes, and infrastructure below. The threat of landslides now looms over any area with elevation, leaving people in these regions on edge, listening for the telltale rumble of the earth giving way. Meanwhile, water supply systems are now in serious jeopardy. Treatment plants that were struggling yesterday have reached their breaking point. Water contamination becomes a growing issue as runoff from agriculture and sewage mixes into the rivers that supply drinking water. Boil water advisories go out to countless communities, and bottled water starts flying off store shelves as no one knows how long the clean water will last. The systems that usually keep water safe are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of rain and the inability to properly filter and treat the deluge. Power generation, especially hydroelectric, faces a precarious balance. Dams are at risk of breaching, and emergency measures are taken to release water to avoid catastrophic failures. But the controlled releases only worsen the flooding downstream, where the extra water adds to the chaos already unfolding. Wind and solar energy sources are severely diminished as rain and cloud cover dominate the skies, cutting off significant portions of the power supply. Power outages become more common as parts of the grid fail under the constant strain. Wildlife is in full retreat. By the second day, animals that could flee to higher ground have done so, but not all creatures are so lucky. Birds are grounded, unable to take to the air in the unceasing downpour, while smaller mammals drown or face exposure. The disruption in the ecosystem becomes more visible as predators and prey are forced out of their usual habitats, leading to unusual behavior, conflict, and further stress on already fragile populations. Soil erosion continues unabated, and what was once a slow process becomes a torrent of mud and debris. Farmland, hillsides, and even the edges of rivers crumble into the water. Once fertile land is stripped away by the rain, carrying valuable topsoil into streams and rivers, choking them with sediment. The erosion now threatens not just the land, but also the buildings and roads near these areas. For those living in urban housing, the second day feels like a turning point. The rain is no longer something that will pass soon. It's a force they'll need to reckon with. Leaks that were minor annoyances yesterday have turned into serious problems as roofs sag and gutters overflow. In the worst cases, entire sections of homes are beginning to flood, with furniture ruined and electronics fried. In apartment complexes, power outages are more frequent, elevators are out of service, and people begin to feel trapped in their own homes. Drainage systems, designed to handle occasional heavy rain, are no match for this continuous onslaught. Sewers back up, and foul-smelling water bubbles up into streets and homes. Maintenance crews are overwhelmed, with no hope of keeping up with the rapidly failing infrastructure. In many places, water begins pooling in dangerous amounts, making even a short walk outside treacherous. Health concerns are growing. With standing water everywhere, the spread of waterborne diseases is a real threat. People who have waded through floodwaters to get home or to help neighbors begin to show signs of infections. Hospitals, already dealing with more emergency cases, are beginning to prepare for a spike in illness caused by the unsanitary conditions brought on by the flooding. Respiratory issues from the constant dampness, stress-related complications, and injuries from the flooded streets are all on the rise. Communication networks are failing in some areas. Towers and cables are affected by the endless rain, and power outages disrupt internet and phone service. For people cut off from reliable communication, it becomes harder to reach emergency services or stay informed about the growing dangers around them. Information becomes scarcer, adding to the anxiety of a population now facing a weather event unlike any they've experienced before. Coastal regions are in serious trouble. The water levels are creeping ever closer to homes and businesses that rely on being near the ocean. Storm surges combine with the nonstop rain to create dangerous conditions, and the erosion of the coastline accelerates. Entire stretches of beaches are washed away, and with them, the livelihoods of those who depend on tourism and fishing. The sea, once a source of life and income, has become a menacing force, threatening to reclaim the land bit by bit. Tourism, which saw a sharp decline on the first day, is now at a standstill. Hotels are emptying, flights are being canceled, and tourists trapped in rain-soaked destinations are doing whatever they can to leave. Businesses that rely on the tourist trade begin to close their doors as the rain shows no sign of stopping. The local economies of these areas take a hard hit, and there's no telling when things might return to normal. The global economy begins to feel the effects as shipping routes are disrupted, factories in affected regions shut down, and the price of goods starts to rise. What was initially a localized problem is now spreading, and industries that rely on stable weather patterns are facing shortages and delays. Investors, sensing the growing instability, start pulling back, and markets begin to react to the uncertainty brought on by this unprecedented weather. Weather patterns are now entirely off-kilter. Meteorologists are baffled as the rain seems to feed itself, a self-perpetuating cycle of moisture that has taken on a life of its own. Storm systems that should have passed are stuck in place, and the unrelenting downpour stretches far beyond the initial area. Predictions become harder to make, and the scope of the event grows ever wider. In the forests, trees struggle to stay upright as their roots lose grip in the waterlogged soil. Those that fall create a dangerous domino effect, taking down others in their wake. The ecosystem begins to break down, as plants that depend on a delicate balance of moisture rot and decay, leaving gaps in the food chain that ripple outward. Animals, already displaced, are now facing a lack of food as the natural order collapses. Ecosystems as a whole begin to unravel. Water that should have nourished life has become too much, drowning plants, animals, and habitats. The second day is just a hint of what's to come, a signal that nothing will be untouched by the rain that refuses to end. Every living thing feels its presence, and the question that lingers on everyone's mind is how long they can hold on before the damage becomes irreversible. Day 3. By the third day of unrelenting rain, the world is in a full-blown crisis. The rivers and lakes that once served as calm, life-sustaining bodies of water have now transformed into relentless torrents. In many places, riverbanks have collapsed completely. What were once peaceful shorelines are now erased, replaced by fast-moving, destructive floods that carry debris, trees, and even entire sections of land. Lakes, no longer able to contain the endless rain, have spilled over, turning surrounding areas into vast swamps. People living near these once picturesque locations are forced to abandon their homes, watching helplessly as the water swallows everything they own. Agriculture is all but decimated by now. Day 3 means crops have been submerged for far too long. The soil, once full of nutrients and life, has turned into a soggy mass, incapable of supporting any more growth. Fields that were once green and full of promise are now brown, waterlogged wastelands. Farmers who hoped for a reprieve on day 2 now face a harsh reality. There's no saving the harvest. Livestock, too, are suffering. Animals are stuck in muddy, unsanitary conditions, and disease begins to spread. Desperation sets in as food supplies begin to dwindle, and there's no telling how or when relief will come. Transportation has become nearly impossible. Roads are no longer just flooded, they're impassable. Major highways resemble rivers more than routes for cars, with stranded vehicles abandoned as water overtakes them. Bridges, which held steady for the first 2 days, are now crumbling as the unyielding rain erodes their supports. Railways are submerged, train services halted, and airports have closed, with runways drenched in water and planes grounded indefinitely. People are stranded, cut off from their families, their jobs, and any semblance of normal life. What once took minutes to travel now takes hours, if it's even possible at all. Infrastructure is in a dire state. The cracks that appeared on day 2 are now full-blown failures. Streets are crumbling, buildings are starting to show signs of structural damage, and construction sites have become dangerous, half-collapsed ruins. Emergency services are stretched beyond capacity, with roads and buildings in such disrepair that rescue efforts are slow and, in many cases, impossible. Water seeps into the foundations of homes and businesses, making them unsafe, but there's no escaping it. Everything is wet, everywhere. Flooding is at its worst, and it's clear that no amount of sandbags or pumps can hold the water back anymore. Entire towns are submerged. People are climbing onto roofs, hoping that the rain will stop before they lose everything. But the rain doesn't stop. Instead, it falls harder, faster, and with more intensity. Floodwaters carry cars, trees, and parts of houses downstream, creating hazardous conditions for anyone trying to move to higher ground. The thought of evacuation grows more desperate as the avenues to escape dwindle. Landslides have become a constant threat, especially in hilly or mountainous areas. By day 3, the saturated soil has completely lost its stability. Entire hillsides collapse, burying roads, homes, and anything in their path under tons of mud, rocks, and debris. The destruction is swift and catastrophic, often leaving no time for warning. Even those who thought they were safe, living far from the rivers and lowlands, now face a new kind of terror, as the earth itself seems to crumble under the relentless force of the rain. Water supply systems have reached a critical failure. Treatment plants are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water, and many have shut down altogether, unable to filter the increasingly contaminated water rushing into their systems. What was once a reliable source of clean drinking water has become tainted by chemicals, sewage, and debris. Bottled water is scarce, and people begin hoarding what they can, knowing that clean water is becoming a rare commodity. The fear of running out grows more palpable with every passing hour. Power generation is on the verge of collapse. Hydroelectric dams are struggling to handle the continuous influx of water. The pressure on the dams is immense, and engineers are faced with impossible decisions. Release more water and worsen the flooding downstream, or risk a catastrophic failure. Power outages are widespread. Solar farms, already rendered nearly useless by the constant cloud cover, are now flooded. Wind turbines spin pointlessly in the gusts, but they can't make up for the loss of other power sources. Cities plunge into darkness, with only intermittent flashes of electricity providing brief relief. Wildlife, which initially fled to higher ground, now faces annihilation. Forests, fields, and wetlands have all been overrun by water, and the animals that couldn't escape have drowned or been displaced into unfamiliar environments. Predators and prey are forced into the same small spaces, leading to chaos in the natural order. Birds, grounded by the rain, starve without the ability to hunt or forage. The devastation to habitats is irreversible, and even the most resilient species are struggling to survive. Soil erosion has reached critical levels. Every drop of rain further weakens the land, washing away what little stability remains. Fields, once held together by roots and vegetation, are now rivers of mud. Hillsides and cliffs are collapsing into valleys below, taking trees, homes, and roads with them. What's left behind is a barren, scarred landscape, stripped of its fertility and future potential. By day 3, the land itself seems to be disintegrating. In urban areas, the struggle is now one of sheer survival. Housing, particularly in lower-income neighborhoods, is no longer safe. Roofs leak, walls crumble, and basements are fully submerged. Evacuations are ongoing, but there's no telling where people can go. Shelters are full, and many areas that were safe yesterday are now underwater. The rain shows no mercy, and residents who thought they could ride out the storm are realizing they'll have to abandon their homes. The fear of losing everything is all-consuming. Drainage systems, which failed on day 2, are now completely overwhelmed. Sewers have backed up entirely, and water flows unchecked through streets, homes, and businesses. The stench of raw sewage is pervasive, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. Without any way to remove the water, cities are left to slowly drown in their own waste. The systems built to manage occasional storms are useless against this relentless onslaught. Human health is starting to deteriorate in more ways than one. Waterborne diseases are spreading as people wade through filthy floodwaters. Skin infections, gastrointestinal issues, and respiratory problems are becoming widespread. Hospitals, which were already strained, are overwhelmed. Clean water is running out, and without it, basic hygiene becomes impossible. Mental health is also taking a severe hit. The endless rain, the constant stress of survival, and the uncertainty about the future weigh heavily on everyone, from children to the elderly. People are scared, exhausted, and beginning to lose hope. Communication networks have collapsed in many areas. Cell towers have been flooded or knocked over, and phone lines are down. Without power, internet service is intermittent at best. People are cut off from each other, unable to call for help or check on loved ones. In rural areas, where communication was already sparse, the isolation is total. Information becomes a commodity, and rumors spread like wildfire, adding to the growing panic. Coastal regions are being hit especially hard. The rain has combined with higher tides, causing massive flooding along coastlines. Beachfront properties, once considered prime real estate, are now underwater. Businesses that relied on tourism or fishing are closing their doors for good. The economic toll is staggering, and with each passing day, the chances of recovery seem more and more remote. The sea is encroaching on the land, and there's no stopping it. The tourism industry is devastated. Hotels are empty, flights are grounded, and popular destinations are submerged. The once thriving tourism economies are now ghost towns, with businesses shuttered and jobs lost. Travelers who were stuck on day 1 are now desperate to leave. But the infrastructure has crumbled, making escape nearly impossible. There's no telling when, or if, tourists will return. The global economy is starting to feel the pinch in a significant way. Supply chains are disrupted, crops are failing, and production has slowed to a crawl. The stock markets, initially reacting to localized problems, are now in free fall as the scope of the disaster becomes apparent. Food shortages, power outages, and failing infrastructure in multiple countries create a ripple effect that spreads across the globe. Investors panic, businesses fail, and unemployment skyrockets. Weather patterns are now completely destabilized. The rain isn't just confined to one region anymore, it's spreading. Other parts of the world, which were dry just days ago, are now seeing similar downpours. The global climate is in chaos, with meteorologists struggling to understand what's happening. The systems that once dictated weather patterns are gone, replaced by something entirely unpredictable. Forests are suffering immensely. Trees, unable to withstand the waterlogged soil, are toppling over in droves. What was once dense, vibrant forest is now a graveyard of fallen trees and rotting vegetation. The ecosystems that depended on the forest are collapsing, with animals displaced and plant life drowned. The long-term effects of this destruction will be felt for decades as the damage to these natural resources becomes clear. Entire ecosystems are unraveling. Plants and animals that depended on specific environmental conditions are now struggling to survive. Wetlands are expanding uncontrollably, while dry areas are being overrun with water. The delicate balance that allowed life to thrive in these ecosystems is gone, replaced by chaos. Day 5. By the 5th day of unrelenting rain, the world has begun to feel like it's teetering on the edge of collapse. There's no trace left of normalcy as rivers, once gentle and flowing, have morphed into raging forces. They've swelled far beyond their banks, carrying everything they touch in a powerful torrent. Lakes, long since overflown, have created new, unintended water bodies where farmland and towns used to be. Any hope of the water receding has vanished, leaving people with no choice but to brace for worse. The ceaseless roar of rushing water drowns out the sound of nature, of life, and the overwhelming presence of it feels like it might never leave. Agriculture has long passed the tipping point. Fields that once grew wheat, rice, and vegetables are no longer recognizable. They've transformed into deep, stagnant pools. Entire crops rot beneath the water, and the stink of decay lingers in the air. Farmers can no longer pretend there's anything to save. In many places, they've stopped going out to the fields altogether because looking at the destruction only deepens the hopelessness. The animals fare no better. Herds are stranded on small islands of dry land, if they haven't drowned or succumbed to disease. What was once a rhythm of seasons and harvests has turned into an unbroken stretch of devastation with no future in sight. Transportation, as a functioning concept, barely exists anymore. By day 5, not a single road is usable. All routes have become rivers in their own right, some deep enough to swallow cars whole. Those who dared to travel in the early days are now stuck, stranded in makeshift camps along highways, desperately hoping for help that will never come. Trains are stuck on tracks that are underwater, if the tracks haven't been washed away entirely. The sky remains empty as well. Airports are flooded, and planes sit motionless, grounded by water and fear. It seems that the world has become an island of its own, divided by impassable stretches of water. The infrastructure is in shambles. Buildings that weren't constructed to withstand this kind of continuous rain have already begun to crumble. Concrete disintegrates under the unrelenting downpour. Steel rusts faster than anyone could have imagined, and wooden structures have soaked through, softening like sponges. The sound of roofs collapsing, of walls giving way, is now commonplace. Hospitals, fire stations, even emergency shelters, all are at risk of becoming uninhabitable. Cities that once stood tall and resilient have begun to buckle under the weight of a disaster that no one prepared for. Flooding has reached catastrophic levels. The floodwaters, having no place to go, have turned entire landscapes into endless sheets of water. Urban centers are submerged, malls, schools, government buildings, all lost to the advancing deluge. Even places once thought safe, like hilltops and elevated areas, are now in jeopardy. The speed at which the water rises has grown alarming. Overnight, streets and neighborhoods that were just starting to dry are submerged again, and this time, they won't be so lucky. People who once thought they could wait out the rain now scramble to flee, though there's nowhere left to run. The land itself can't hold any longer. Landslides, which started small and localized, have now become massive. Entire hillsides break loose, cascading down with violent force, burying everything in their path. Whole neighborhoods disappear in seconds, swallowed by mud and debris, with no hope of rescue. The ground is saturated beyond capacity, and any semblance of stability is gone. With every new hour of rain, more and more areas are at risk of collapse, and those lucky enough to avoid the landslides know it's only a matter of time before the earth beneath their feet gives way too. Water supply systems have not just been compromised, they've failed completely. The pipes and treatment plants designed to keep drinking water safe are overwhelmed with dirty floodwater. Entire reservoirs have been contaminated by chemicals, raw sewage, and debris. What little water can be pumped out is dangerously unsafe to drink. People are forced to drink from whatever source they can find, leading to widespread outbreaks of waterborne illnesses. The rain, which in theory should be a blessing for hydration, is anything but. It's undrinkable, dirty, and carrying disease. Power generation is no longer reliable, if it's functioning at all. Dams, where water once worked in humanity's favor, are at risk of breaking under the enormous pressure. The floodgates, opened days ago in a desperate attempt to manage the water, now threaten to let loose catastrophic floods downstream. Other power sources, such as coal plants and solar farms, are underwater or simply useless in the constant rain. Electrical grids flicker in and out, plunging entire regions into darkness, and the realization sets in that widespread. Lasting blackouts are inevitable. The infrastructure simply can't handle the magnitude of this endless storm. Wildlife, if it hasn't already fled or died, is facing extinction in many areas. Habitats have been wiped away, food sources drowned or rotting. The balance that nature once struck between predator and prey is gone, leaving species to fight over dwindling territory. Birds, unable to fly in the relentless downpour, huddle together, starving. Fish and aquatic animals thrive, but only at the cost of everything else. The natural order has collapsed alongside the human one, and the world has become a wet, inhospitable wasteland for most living things. Soil erosion is a silent, unstoppable force now. It's not just washing away the land. It's taking with it everything that once made the earth fertile and rich. Nutrients are being swept downstream into the floodwaters, leaving behind barren, rocky patches where nothing will grow for years. Hills and valleys are being reshaped in unnatural ways, as each day of rain strips away more of what holds the land together. There is no longer a question of how bad erosion will be. It's already disastrous. In housing and urban areas, survival has become a minute-to-minute struggle. Homes that withstood the first few days are now flooded to the rooftops, and the lucky few who found shelter there are beginning to run out of food and resources. Even the high-rise buildings, once thought safe, are showing cracks. Electricity is spotty, and fresh water is a memory. People are packed into whatever dry spaces they can find, but overcrowding is leading to new dangers. Disease spreads fast, and tempers are rising as resources dwindle. Entire cities are being slowly swallowed by the water, and no one knows what will happen next. Drainage systems, which were designed to handle heavy rain for a day or two, have collapsed under the unending storm. The pipes are full, the sewers are overflowing, and the streets are more like canals than avenues for cars. Raw sewage mixes with floodwater, creating toxic rivers that flow through the city unchecked. The stench of decay and filth is omnipresent, and the systems that once made urban life possible are nothing but a distant memory. Human health, already strained by the stress of constant rain and loss of shelter, is rapidly deteriorating. Hospitals are flooded, medicine is running low, and there's no end in sight for the diseases spreading through the population. Waterborne illnesses, respiratory infections, and skin diseases are rampant. Mental health is in crisis. People are breaking under the relentless pressure, the loss of homes, loved ones, and any sense of security. Anxiety is universal, and the realization that the rain isn't stopping is driving people to their limits. Communication networks are practically non-existent by now. Cell towers have been damaged or knocked out entirely, and the internet is a distant memory in most places. Radio communication remains in some regions, but even that is spotty at best. The sense of isolation is crushing, as people can no longer reach out to loved ones, no longer call for help. Communities are left to fend for themselves, without any reliable way to communicate or coordinate rescue efforts. The coastal regions, which began feeling the impact on day one, are now fully under siege. Rising sea levels combined with unrelenting rain have turned coastal cities into swamps. The ocean and rain have merged into one, erasing the boundary between land and sea. Homes are swept away, businesses destroyed, and there's no way to hold back the encroaching water. Salt water is mixing with freshwater sources, further complicating any hope of drinking water, and the beaches have long since disappeared beneath the waves. Tourism, already decimated, is now a complete non-entity. Resorts, once luxurious getaways, are underwater. Famous landmarks are either submerged or unrecognizable under the deluge. Entire industries that relied on visitors have shuttered for good, and the economic fallout is staggering. Travelers stranded in foreign countries have given up hope of returning home anytime soon, and vacation destinations have become places of despair and ruin. There's no room for leisure in a world where survival is the only goal. The global economy is unraveling. Trade routes have shut down, crops have failed, and industries are collapsing one by one. Markets are in free fall, with no one able to predict when or how things might recover. The interconnectedness of the world's economies, once a strength, now ensures that the disaster spreads far beyond the regions directly impacted by the rain. Countries that once provided aid to others are now in need themselves, and the international community is paralyzed by the sheer scale of the crisis. Weather patterns, which once followed a predictable rhythm, are now chaotic. Meteorologists are at a loss to explain the unrelenting rain, as systems that usually break apart after a few days have strengthened instead. The rain is spreading, and regions that were dry at the start are now experiencing their own deluge. The concept of seasons feels like a relic of a different world, as the rain ignores all the usual rules and continues its assault without regard for normal climate behavior. Forests, which once absorbed the rainfall and balanced the ecosystem, are dying. Trees are being uprooted, their roots no longer able to hold in the saturated soil. What remains of the forests is a graveyard of fallen giants, and the once lush, thriving ecosystems have turned into swamps. Fires are no longer a concern. It's the drowning that poses the threat now, as entire forests are lost to waterlogged ground. Ecosystems everywhere are teetering on the edge of collapse. Flooded rivers, dying forests, eroded soil, and polluted air are all contributing to the slow, inevitable breakdown of life as it was. Species that can't adapt to the new, waterlogged reality are dying out, and the balance that once sustained life on Earth is unraveling faster than anyone could have imagined. The rain keeps falling, and the world beneath it continues to break. Day 7. By the time day 7 rolls around, the constant rain would start to wear people down in ways they hadn't imagined when the first drops fell. At first, there would have been attempts to shrug it off. Umbrellas, raincoats, a shift in daily routines, thinking it might just be an odd stretch of weather. But 7 days of relentless downpour would have a way of creeping into every aspect of life. Streets that were once navigable would be flooded, not just puddles, but rising water that could swallow cars and make neighborhoods feel like islands. Homes near rivers or in low-lying areas would be filled with the ominous sound of water lapping at doors and windows. There's no stopping it. Humanity, resourceful as ever, would be split between those who tried to carry on and those who began to panic. Some would barricade themselves indoors, stacking furniture and belongings higher, trying to protect what little they could as the water climbed. Others would start to pack up, fleeing to higher ground if they could, searching for places where the rain hadn't yet caused too much damage, but those places would be disappearing fast. Power outages would start to become a new reality in many places. Substations flooded, transformers shorted out, entire blocks going dark. Those relying on electricity for medical devices, communication, or even just heat would be stranded without it, and a sense of isolation would grow. Cell phone towers would start to fail, making it harder to check on loved ones or call for help. In some places, rescue operations would begin, boats navigating through suburban streets, but there wouldn't be enough of them. Emergency services would be stretched thin, and people would realize they might have to fend for themselves. The relentless rain would make it impossible to dry clothes or blankets, creating a world that felt permanently damp. Mold would begin to grow in homes and buildings, turning places of shelter into sources of sickness. People, huddled together in whatever dry corners remained, would become irritable, worn down by the claustrophobia of it all, by the endless drum of rain on the roof. Tensions would rise. Communities that had once seemed strong would fracture under the pressure. Food supplies would become an issue. Transportation routes cut off by water meant that grocery store shelves would start to empty. Some people would start hoarding what little they could find. Neighbors who had once shared pleasantries would become protective of their resources, suspicious of one another's intentions. The veneer of civility would begin to wear thin. In larger cities, the infrastructure would be hit hard. The sewer systems would be overwhelmed by the endless torrent, causing sewage to back up into streets and homes, adding the stench of waste to the already unbearable conditions. Health risks would mount as waterborne diseases began to spread, adding another layer of anxiety. The constant rain, which had initially felt like a mild inconvenience, would now feel like an unending threat, something that had the potential to reshape life in ways no one had anticipated. In rural areas, farmers would watch as their crops were ruined, fields turning into muddy swamps. The rain would destroy livelihoods and create an overwhelming sense of loss. Animals would struggle too, livestock without shelter, or wild creatures displaced from their habitats, forced into new areas where they didn't belong. And emotionally, people would be drained. The rain would seep into their minds as much as it did their homes. That gray sky, with no break in the clouds for a week, would strip away optimism, leaving only the fear that it might never stop. What started as a natural event would evolve into a psychological weight that seemed impossible to lift. Conversations would shift from hope for sunny days to murmurs of survival, of what to do if the water kept rising. Day 10. By day 10, the rain would no longer feel like a temporary disruption, but an all-consuming force, something that was altering the very fabric of daily life. The continuous downpour would have transformed cities, towns, and countryside alike into waterlogged, half-drowned versions of themselves. People would be tired, beyond just physically. The endless gray sky, the constant drumming on every surface, it would have chipped away at people's sense of normalcy, and now, it would be cutting into their sense of control. Everyone would be feeling it. The water levels would have risen to a point where the landscape no longer looked familiar. Entire streets would be submerged, with only the tops of cars or the occasional rooftop visible. The rain wouldn't just flood homes anymore. It would swallow them. Many people would have already been forced out of their houses, not just by rising waters, but by the sheer unlivability of damp, cold, mold-infested interiors. There'd be a quiet exodus of those who could move to higher ground, creating clusters of makeshift camps, not unlike the aftermath of natural disasters. But this wouldn't feel like an aftermath. It would feel like the beginning of something new and terrifying. Communities, where people once found solace in their neighbors, would be divided between those who prepared and those who didn't. Tensions would simmer under the surface, not always exploding into violence but manifesting in glares, muttered suspicions, and silent accusations. People who'd once been friendly would avoid each other, their discomfort exacerbated by the wet, the cold, and the unrelenting uncertainty. Trust would be hard to come by when resources were running low, and resources would definitely be running low. Food, especially fresh food, would be scarce. Supply chains, already struggling after a week of rain, would be paralyzed. Flooded roads and washed-out bridges would make restocking stores impossible. People would turn to whatever they had stockpiled, rationing out canned goods, dried food, anything that could last. But even the most well-prepared would start to realize their supplies were finite. It wouldn't just be about hunger, it would be about the realization that there might be no end in sight. That gnawing doubt would weigh on everyone's minds. Power would be a thing of the past in many areas. Electrical grids wouldn't just be malfunctioning. They'd be gone, shorted out by waterlogged systems that weren't built to withstand this kind of endless weather. People who still had power would hoard it, charging devices sparingly, rationing battery life like it was gold. The darkness, once just a result of power outages, would now seem like a companion to the rain. Without lights, without the usual distractions of television or the internet, the world would feel smaller, more primal, more immediate. Hospitals would be overflowing, not just with the injured or the sick, but with people suffering from illnesses related to the flooding. Respiratory issues from damp, unsanitary conditions would spread, and waterborne diseases would start to take hold. The most vulnerable, the elderly, children, and those with pre-existing health conditions, would struggle the most. But even the strong and healthy would start to break under the strain. There'd be little relief, no way to escape the feeling of being trapped in a wet, suffocating world. The rain would strip away layers of civility. In urban areas, looting would become more frequent. At first, it would have been for essentials, food, medicine, dry clothing. But by day 10, desperation would drive people to take whatever they could, not because they needed it immediately, but because they feared what was coming. The social contract that had once held communities together would feel fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. Law enforcement, already stretched thin, would struggle to maintain order as they themselves dealt with personal loss and exhaustion. In rural areas, it would be a different kind of survival. The countryside, which initially seemed like a refuge, would turn hostile as fields became lakes, animals drowned or starved, and isolated farms became unreachable. Self-sufficiency would no longer feel like a comfort but a lonely struggle as roads to town became rivers, cutting off access to help or supplies. People would start to wonder how long they could hold out. Mentally, the rain would be unrelenting. It wasn't just the physical destruction. It was the psychological toll of living in a world where the sun hadn't shone for 10 straight days. The human spirit, resilient as it is, would start to fray at the edges. Even the optimists, the ones who held out hope for a break in the clouds, would find themselves staring out at the rain with a kind of hollow resignation. Conversations would grow quieter, less about what people had planned to do and more about what was necessary for survival. Everything else would feel irrelevant. Day 20. By day 20, the world as people once knew it would be unrecognizable. The rain would have stopped feeling like a natural disaster and started to feel like a permanent state of existence. Entire regions would be submerged underwater, with rivers swollen beyond capacity, lakes spilling over, and the ocean creeping into coastal areas. The boundaries between land and water would be blurred. Cities that had once been towering symbols of human achievement would now be crumbling, their lower floors filled with murky, debris-laden water. The skyline might still be visible, but everything below would be drowning. Those who had survived this long would not just be adapting, they'd be transforming. Survival would have become the only goal, overriding everything else. The infrastructure that once kept society running would be completely gone. The idea of electricity, internet, even communication by phone would be a distant memory in most places. People would have moved away from trying to maintain any semblance of their old routines and instead would focus on scavenging for food, clean water, and dry shelter. Canned food and preserved goods, once a backup plan, would be running dangerously low, and desperation would lead people to consider dangerous options, eating what they could find, no matter the risks. The luxury of choice would have long disappeared. The water would be everywhere, and with it, the stench of rot and decay. Bodies of animals and, in some places, even humans would be floating in the flooded streets, casualties of a world that had been slowly drowned. Disease would be rampant. Waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery would spread uncontrollably, turning small cuts or scrapes into life-threatening infections. Hospitals, if they were still standing, would be overwhelmed or completely abandoned, with medical supplies long gone. The strongest would be left to fend for themselves, while the weak, the elderly, and the sick would be left behind, unable to keep up in the brutal new reality. Social order would have disintegrated entirely. In urban centers, the remnants of law and order would be non-existent. Those with the resources, food, weapons, dry spaces, would form groups, some protective, others predatory. Looting and theft would no longer be about survival but about dominance, as people fought for control of the few remaining valuable resources. Organized crime might rise, not with the goal of profit, but as a new form of ruling over the chaos. Governments, if they still existed, would be shadows of their former selves, communicating with only the most essential personnel, likely trying to manage emergency responses that had long since been overwhelmed. People wouldn't expect help anymore. They'd know by now that they were on their own. Rural communities, where some had believed they could ride it out, would have been hit just as hard. Crops would have been destroyed, livestock lost to flooding or disease. What little food remained would be guarded fiercely, and trust between neighbors, once the backbone of rural life, would be in short supply. The few who could maintain some form of self-sufficiency, those with higher ground, access to rainwater collection, or a hidden stockpile, would live in constant fear of being discovered by the desperate. Mentally, the toll would be immeasurable. The idea of hope, of the rain stopping, would have evaporated entirely. People wouldn't be talking about what happens next anymore. They wouldn't even dream of the sun breaking through. Conversations, if they happened at all, would be about the barest needs: how to stay dry, where to find food, who could be trusted. The constant sound of rain, which had once been a dull, ever-present hum, would now feel like a form of torture, breaking down even the strongest minds. Depression, paranoia, and a deep sense of isolation would set in. Some people would stop talking altogether, retreating into themselves as a way to cope. Others might not be able to take it anymore, wandering off into the floodwaters in a daze, or worse, deciding that enduring this endless rain wasn't worth the fight anymore. For those who managed to survive, life would no longer be about living. It would be about enduring. The concept of time itself would have shifted. People wouldn't talk about days or weeks. They'd talk about the last time they saw something dry or the last meal they had. By day 20, the rain would have redefined everything. How people thought, how they moved, and who they trusted. It would be a world where the past felt like a dream, and the future was something no one dared to think about. Day 30. By day 30, the rain would have become the defining feature of existence. Entire cities would be submerged under several feet of water, and the idea of roads, buildings, and infrastructure would belong to the past. The rain wouldn't just be an event anymore. It would be the environment. Everything people once took for granted would be gone. Cars would be useless, now floating or submerged relics of a world that was drying up in memory. Public transportation, airports, and anything requiring functional infrastructure would have collapsed completely. Boats, rafts, or anything that could float would become the new means of travel for those who had access to them, and for everyone else, movement would be a dangerous and exhausting task through the water. Entire towns and cities would be abandoned. People who had once lived in low-lying areas or by bodies of water would have either fled or been overtaken by the floods. Higher ground would now be rare, and wherever it could be found, it would be fiercely protected. The populations of areas that were naturally elevated would swell as survivors from elsewhere tried to find refuge, but even these places would be suffering. The constant rain would saturate the ground, turning the landscape into a swampy, mud-filled terrain where nothing was stable, nothing secure. Shelter would be fleeting, temporary, and often inadequate to the unceasing assault of water from above. Clean drinking water would be a dire concern. The rain itself wouldn't be safe anymore, polluted as it would be by the contaminants and chemicals now swirling in the floodwaters. Reservoirs, wells, and even the remaining bottled water would be severely limited, forcing people to drink from tainted sources or take their chances with makeshift filtration systems that couldn't keep up with the scale of contamination. People would get sick in larger numbers, not just from the diseases already spreading, but from dehydration as they struggled to find anything safe to drink. The irony of drowning in water while dying of thirst would weigh heavily on everyone's mind. Sanitation would have completely collapsed. The sewer systems, if they hadn't already backed up and failed, would now be overwhelmed beyond repair. Every floodplain, every low street, every home that was still standing would be soaked not just in rainwater but in raw sewage. Trash, debris, and decaying organic matter would float everywhere, giving the water an oily, foul-smelling appearance. It would be a breeding ground for disease, and survivors would be living in constant fear of infections they had no way to treat. Medical supplies would be non-existent. Pharmacies would have long been emptied of anything useful, and hospitals would either be flooded or overwhelmed with so many sick that they'd essentially cease to function. Anyone with chronic illnesses would already be gone by now, either unable to get their necessary medications or succumbing to the harsh conditions. Survival would favor the young, the strong, and the resourceful, but even they would be tested. Social order would have fractured into isolated, often hostile, pockets of humanity. Governments, if they still existed, would be operating from hidden locations, cut off from the people they were meant to serve. News, communication, any connection to the outside world would be rare, fragmented, and unreliable. There would be no larger narrative, no idea of what was happening across the country or the world. People would rely on rumors, on the stories of others passing through, but nothing could be verified. Most would stop caring. The focus would shift entirely to survival, day by day, moment by moment. Violence would become more common, but it wouldn't be random or chaotic. It would be calculated, desperate. Resources would be fought over, not for greed, but for sheer necessity. People would kill for food, for dry clothing, for access to safe spaces. Trust would be virtually non-existent, and anyone who traveled would do so with extreme caution, aware that they were just as likely to be attacked as they were to find help. Communities, if they still existed, would be small, tightly knit, and fiercely protective of their own. Outsiders would be seen as a threat, no matter how desperate or in need they appeared. Mentally, people would be broken. The rain would have shattered any last vestiges of optimism. Those who had held out hope that it would stop, that the sun would break through and things would return to normal, would have given up. The constant noise of the downpour, the endless dampness, and the isolation would grind away at everyone. Sleep would be rare, as the unceasing rain would turn nights into a suffocating haze of water and noise. Even the strongest would be frayed, with tempers quick to flare and patience worn thin. The concept of the future would feel alien. There would be no more plans, no more dreams, just the immediate need to stay alive. Children, if they were still alive, would have no memories of what the world was like before. They would know only this wet, gray, dangerous existence. Their play, if it even still existed, would be dark, shadowed by the world falling apart around them. They wouldn't be shielded from the harsh realities. They'd be participants in them. Childhood would become an afterthought, replaced by the need to survive, to learn how to navigate a world where rain ruled everything. By day 30, the rain would have remade the world. What was once human civilization would now be something else, a collection of survivors trying to outlast a relentless, uncaring force. The rain would have become the dominant element, eroding not just the land, but the spirit of those who once believed they could control their fate. There would be no more systems, no more networks of support, just water, and those few still clinging to whatever dry scraps of life remained. Day 60. By day 60, the rain would have consumed nearly everything. Vast stretches of land would be underwater, and what remained of civilization would exist only in fragments. Coastal areas would be completely submerged, while entire inland regions would have transformed into endless, sprawling lakes. The few remaining dry places, hilltops, mountaintops, would be packed with the survivors who managed to make it there. There wouldn't be enough space or resources to sustain them all, and it would show. The landscape itself would feel alien. What used to be neighborhoods and cities now erased, buried under murky water, with only the tops of trees and buildings poking out like ghostly markers of what used to be. Those who had made it this far would be a different kind of human, hardened by the 2 months of relentless rain. People would no longer think in terms of a return to normal. Normal had been washed away with the cities, the roads, and all the familiar parts of their old lives. Now, the focus would be on surviving a new reality, one in which rain never stopped, the sky never cleared, and dry land became a rare and precious commodity. Entire communities would have died off by this point, either from starvation, disease, or the violence that accompanied the desperation for resources. What remained would be small, isolated groups of survivors, each struggling to hold onto whatever fragile existence they had carved out. Food would be almost entirely gone. Any stores of non-perishable goods would have been long exhausted, and agriculture would be impossible. The constant rain would have washed away crops, drowned livestock, and left the land unworkable. People would have turned to foraging and scavenging, but there wouldn't be much left to find. Fishing might provide some sustenance, but the flooded waters would be treacherous, filled with debris, pollution, and the decaying remains of what was once the infrastructure of society. The constant search for something to eat would dominate every waking thought. Water, too, would be a paradoxical problem. Surrounded by it, but with so little of it safe to drink. Makeshift filtration systems would be in place, but they'd be failing under the strain of constant use, and the contamination in the floodwaters would make it increasingly difficult to find anything potable. People would drink what they could, taking risks they wouldn't have imagined months before, knowing that dehydration was a quicker death than illness. Infections and diseases would be rampant. The stench of death would hang heavy in the air, human and animal corpses alike floating in the water or caught in debris. The water would be foul, thick with decay, oil slicks from submerged cars and factories, and filth from collapsed sewage systems. Mentally, people would be numb. Hope would no longer exist. It would have disappeared after the first month, when people still believed the rain might end. Now, it wouldn't even be discussed. Everyone who had survived this long would have accepted that the rain was permanent. There wouldn't be much conversation beyond the immediate needs of survival. People wouldn't be making plans or talking about rebuilding. They'd be focused on the next meal, the next drink of water, the next patch of shelter. Exhaustion would be a constant companion. Sleep would come sporadically, when it could, but always interrupted by the discomfort of being soaked, by the fear of flooding, or by the sounds of others moving around in the dark. The rain itself, the endless drumming, would have receded into the background. It wouldn't even be noticed anymore. It was simply there, like the air, constant, oppressive. Social structures, if they still existed at all, would have devolved into survivalist groups. Any sense of larger community would have been lost. It would be every group for themselves, and within those groups, trust would be fragile. People would be wary, constantly on edge, knowing that betrayal could come at any moment. Leadership would be less about governance and more about control, who had access to food, to shelter, to weapons. Violence would be commonplace, not out of malice, but out of the sheer necessity of survival. Disputes wouldn't be resolved through discussion anymore. They would be settled with force, and those unable to defend themselves would be pushed aside, left to fend on their own or die. The weather, once something people merely talked about in passing, would now dominate their existence. The air would be cold, damp, and heavy with moisture, adding to the sense of weight pressing down on everyone. Clothes, constantly soaked, would never dry, causing infections, skin diseases, and general discomfort that would wear away at people's health and morale. Shelter wouldn't be about comfort anymore. It would simply be about finding a place that was marginally dry, or at least above water. Children, if there were any still alive, would be barely recognizable as the children they once were. There would be no laughter, no play. They'd have learned quickly that the world was hostile, that trust and joy were dangerous luxuries. Their innocence would be gone, replaced by a grim understanding of survival. They'd be raised on stories of a world that no longer existed, stories of sunlight, dry land, and warmth that would seem like fantasies. By day 60, humanity would be on the edge. Those who had made it this far would not just be survivors. They would be a different breed of human altogether, stripped of everything but the most primal instincts. Civilization, as it had once been known, would be a memory submerged under endless rain. The fight would no longer be about reclaiming what was lost, but about enduring what had become the new, unending reality. Day 100. By day 100, survival would be a miracle. Most of the world would be waterlogged, transformed into an endless, desolate sea with only a few scattered islands of land left above the surface. Entire nations would be drowned, continents reduced to isolated pockets of high ground where the few remaining survivors clung to life. Any sense of what the world had once been would have dissolved beneath the unyielding downpour. The geography people once knew, mountains, valleys, rivers, cities, would be submerged memories, and all that would remain would be the fight to stay alive another day. The survivors would be drastically fewer. Many would have succumbed to hunger, disease, or the violence that had come with the competition for the last remaining resources. What food could be found would be scarce, meager at best, and rotten or contaminated at worst. People would have long since given up any illusions of normal eating habits. They'd be scavenging whatever remained. Rotten vegetables, scavenged fish from polluted waters, whatever animals hadn't drowned or disappeared. Starvation would have claimed countless lives, and those who survived would be gaunt, skeletal, their bodies worn thin from malnutrition and constant struggle. Communication between the remaining pockets of humanity would have been cut off entirely. Radios would be useless, power grids destroyed beyond repair, and even the few functioning boats or makeshift rafts that existed would rarely travel far, for fear of what might be out there. The world would feel small, shrunken to whatever patch of land people had managed to cling to. Everyone would be isolated in their own harsh, wet reality, with no sense of what might be happening beyond the horizon. Desperation would be inescapable. Groups of survivors would turn inward, suspicious of anyone they didn't know, guarding their dwindling supplies with fierce paranoia. Trust would be non-existent, and any stranger who appeared would be treated as a threat. Violence wouldn't even be a matter of survival. It would be instinctive, immediate, a way of defending what little people had left. There would be no more room for mercy or negotiation. If someone had food or shelter, it was theirs until someone stronger took it from them. It would be brutal, and the few remaining social bonds that existed would be tenuous at best. Sanitation and health would be at their lowest point yet. People would be living in filth, surrounded by water that was toxic with waste, decay, and disease. The bodies of the dead, whether human or animal, would be everywhere, rotting in the floodwaters, carried by the currents, and piling up wherever they got caught. The smell would be unbearable, a constant reminder of death, disease, and the slow collapse of the world. Sickness would be rampant, with infections spreading uncontrollably, killing quickly, and with little hope of treatment. There would be no hospitals, no doctors, no medicine left. People would simply die, and their bodies would become part of the landscape. Mentally, the rain would have broken most people. Living in a world where it never stopped would have done more than just wear down the body. It would have shattered the mind. The noise of the rain, constant and inescapable, would drive many to madness. It would be impossible to escape the sound, the wetness, the sensation of being trapped under an endless downpour. Depression, paranoia, and even hallucinations would become common. People might wander off into the water, either because they could no longer tell what was real or because they simply couldn't take it anymore. Conversations, if they happened at all, would be short, focused on survival, and devoid of any warmth or hope. Children, those who remained, would be little more than shadows of their former selves. They would be hardened, distant, their innocence gone, replaced by the cold knowledge that life was short, brutal, and unfair. They would have no memory of the world before the rain, no concept of what sunlight or dry land felt like. For them, the rain would be all there was, and they would grow up knowing nothing but struggle and survival. The older generation, those who still remembered the world before, would look at these children with a mixture of sadness and disbelief, knowing that the future they had once imagined for them was now a distant, impossible dream. By day 100, survival would no longer be about living. It would be about enduring the unrelenting rain, the hunger, the cold, and the isolation. People would have stopped waiting for the rain to end. There would be no more hope for a break in the clouds, no more wishful thinking that the world might return to what it was. They would know, deep down, that this was it. This was the new reality. The rain wouldn't stop, and they would have to keep pushing forward, not because they believed in a future, but because they didn't know how to stop. Day 500. By day 500 of continuous rain, the world has fundamentally transformed. In the early days, people tried to adapt, but now the relentless downpour has pushed humanity to its limits. Cities are submerged, their towering structures peaking above vast, endless water. Highways have become canals, and the transportation of goods is nearly impossible except for the few who have access to boats or makeshift rafts. Food scarcity is rampant. The agricultural collapse began months ago when crops drowned, fields turned into lakes, and livestock either perished or were abandoned. Supplies from stockpiled reserves have dwindled, and governments, overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, struggle to maintain any semblance of order. In this soaked world, homes are fortresses against the elements. People who once lived on the ground floor have long since fled or relocated to the upper levels. Apartments that were on the third or fourth floor are now at water level. Those who live in the higher altitudes have become the new aristocracy, trading shelter and resources for goods, services, or even loyalty. The social dynamics have changed in unexpected ways as survival, not wealth or status, dictates power. There is no sunshine to warm the air, no seasons to break the monotony, just the unending gray skies and the sound of water, an oppressive constant that gnaws at people's sanity. Infrastructure has decayed. Power grids, initially supported by emergency measures, failed months ago. Cities that were once bright and alive with energy have become dark, ghostly shadows. People rely on makeshift generators, but fuel is a precious commodity. Communication systems are unreliable, and in many places, they have gone silent. Communities have become isolated, cut off from one another, and the once globalized world is now fragmented. Those who still have working technology use it sparingly, conserving energy, and every piece of working machinery is a treasure to be protected. Psychologically, the rain wears on the human spirit. Depression and hopelessness are rampant, and the never-ending moisture has a chilling effect on emotions. People don't remember what dry land feels like under their feet. Mold and mildew are a constant presence, eating away at structures and even at personal health. Respiratory diseases have surged, with hospitals overwhelmed or simply no longer functioning. The absence of sunlight, the endless dampness, and the constant roar of rain make it nearly impossible for people to feel at peace. Nature itself has turned against them, and many no longer see the world as it was, only the ruins of what it has become. Human relationships have evolved under this pressure. Trust has become a precious commodity, and betrayal a frequent reality. Communities that once worked together in solidarity have fractured, with paranoia and selfishness driving many to hoard resources and protect their own. But for some, the bond of survival has created unbreakable ties, as they lean on each other in ways they never thought possible before. The sense of unity, however fragile, offers some hope that humanity can endure even under the most severe circumstances. But there are darker stories as well. In the isolated, flooded towns and cities, rumors spread of lawlessness, of groups who have embraced violence as a means of control. Survival, in these places, is not just about finding food or shelter, but also about avoiding those who prey on others. Some individuals and factions have turned to extremes to stay alive. The world, in many ways, has regressed, and in some areas, it's a fight not just against nature but against human nature itself. The environment is irreversibly altered. Rivers have merged with oceans, ecosystems have collapsed, and species that depended on dry habitats are extinct or clinging to life in ever-shrinking pockets. Coastal cities, once economic hubs, are now underwater, and people speak of them like they would Atlantis, lost, unreachable, and a relic of a world that no longer exists. Even inland areas are struggling. Massive landslides and erosion have destroyed whole regions. Once lush forests are now swamps, their inhabitants either gone or surviving in ways no one could have imagined. At this point, the idea of a normal world is distant, a concept that children born into this endless rain cannot even comprehend. The older generations tell stories of sunny days and clear skies, of dry roads and open fields, but these memories seem like fairy tales. The rain, unceasing and overwhelming, has defined this new world. People cling to the possibility that one day it might stop, but by day 500, most have resigned themselves to the reality that this is their life now, wet, cold, and forever sinking. Day 1000. By day 1000 of the unrelenting rain, the world is barely recognizable and human civilization is on the brink of collapse. The water has swallowed most of the land, leaving behind isolated pockets of humanity clinging to whatever remains of their former lives. Coastal cities are deep underwater, and inland areas, once thought to be safe from flooding, have turned into vast, marshy wastelands. People have become nomads, moving constantly to stay above the ever-rising waters, searching for the rare patches of land that still exist. What once were communities are now clusters of survivors, spread thin across what little ground remains, their lives dictated by the unpredictable shifts in water levels. Food production is almost non-existent. With agriculture a distant memory, the world relies on scavenging and the remains of pre-flood stores. Canned goods are treated like gold, and even these are starting to run out. Desperation has led to innovation for some, with small floating farms being built, but these are a rare luxury and often too fragile to support large populations. Fishing, once abundant in the newly expanded oceans, has become a dangerous venture. The ocean itself is an unpredictable force now, teeming with chaotic currents, debris, and a host of new dangers. The rain has brought with it not just floods, but strange, altered ecosystems where familiar wildlife has disappeared, replaced by species adapting rapidly to this drowned world. Many marine species have died off, while others thrive in unexpected ways, creating an eerie new balance that no one fully understands. The human toll is devastating. By now, sickness has become the norm, with diseases spreading rapidly due to the lack of sanitation, overcrowded shelters, and the absence of reliable medical care. Respiratory infections, waterborne diseases, and malnutrition have claimed millions. Mental health has deteriorated, with widespread depression, anxiety, and apathy taking hold. Those who have survived this long have become hardened, more primal, their humanity eroding with each passing day. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about enduring the crushing weight of hopelessness. In the remnants of the urban world, massive skyscrapers, now islands rising out of the water, have become makeshift settlements. People live in the upper floors of buildings that were once bustling with life and industry. These high-rise refuges are overcrowded and tense. Resources are shared, but distrust runs deep. Many have resorted to barricading themselves in rooms and apartments, hoping to keep others out, afraid of theft, violence, or worse. Some groups have organized small-scale communities within these towers, developing new rules and structures to keep order, but the cracks are always visible. Fights over food, water, and territory break out constantly. Alliances form and dissolve in the span of days, and those who can't hold their ground are quickly pushed out, left to face the waters on their own. Technologically, the world is back to the basics. Power grids, long since defunct, have been replaced by makeshift systems using solar panels or wind turbines salvaged from the flooded remains of the old world. But these sources are fragile, and without proper maintenance, they fail often. Communication is almost non-existent beyond local groups, and the global web of information and connectivity is a thing of the past. Radios are the most reliable way to contact others, but they only reach so far, and much of the world is silent. The few broadcasts that do exist are grim, offering little more than survival tips or warnings about hostile groups. Many regions have become lawless, with governments collapsing under the weight of the ongoing disaster. Authority is a distant memory in most places. The few remaining governments operate from heavily fortified locations, if at all, and their influence doesn't reach far. Military factions, gangs, and warlords have taken control of various territories, ruling through fear and force. Weapons are scarce, but the desperation for survival has made people resourceful in finding new ways to fight. In the larger settlements, trade still exists, but it's crude and often brutal. Bartering has become the primary means of exchange, with food, water, and medicine being the most valuable commodities. Trust is rare, and betrayal is always a lurking possibility. The rain itself has become something of a living force. It's no longer just a backdrop, but an active participant in this slow-motion apocalypse. The weight of it presses down on everything, eroding not just buildings and landscapes, but spirits as well. It has carved new rivers where there were none, turned mountains into waterfalls, and swept away entire towns without a trace. People no longer think of it as an anomaly or a disaster to be weathered. It's just life now. Some even speak of it with a twisted reverence, as though it's a vengeful deity they must appease. Religious groups have sprung up, seeing the rain as punishment or a test of humanity's worth, and their messages range from hope to fanaticism, as they try to make sense of a world that no longer feels like it belongs to humans. For children born into this world, there is no memory of sunshine or dry ground. The older generations speak of times before, but these stories are met with confusion or disbelief. The younger ones are adapted to this soaked existence, more agile in navigating the waterlogged ruins, more attuned to the rhythms of this endless storm. They are tougher, quieter, and more cautious, shaped by an environment where danger and scarcity are constants. The sea levels have risen so dramatically that entire continents are reshaped. Coastal regions have vanished, islands have become submerged mountain peaks, and what was once habitable land is shrinking day by day. People have given up trying to measure how much higher the water will rise. The idea of safety is relative now. Being above water for one more day is all that matters. It's a world where the horizon is always just water meeting sky, an endless gray that stretches out with no promise of change, no future, just survival against a force too great to comprehend. Day 5000. By day 5000 of relentless rain, the world has changed beyond recognition. The skies have remained a dull, endless gray for over 13 years, casting a permanent gloom over everything. Rivers, lakes, and oceans have long since overflowed, consuming coastlines and lowlands, turning entire cities into sunken ruins. People who once lived near the water had to flee to higher ground as their homes disappeared, but there's no escape from the rain. It's everywhere, soaking the world continuously, with no sign of stopping. The landscape is a network of floodwaters, where the high points of mountains and hills are the only visible land left. Infrastructure collapsed years ago, overwhelmed by the weight of the water. Bridges gave out, roads crumbled, and entire regions are now only accessible by boat, if they are accessible at all. The transportation network, one of humanity's key achievements, was rendered useless, isolating communities and making survival a local matter. Electricity, if it exists in some areas, is rare and precarious, powered by makeshift systems built by the desperate or those lucky enough to have access to old generators. Supplies of fuel are almost non-existent, and the energy is used sparingly for vital needs, communication, warmth, or cooking. The rain's constant assault has eroded the soil, leaving much of the land barren and stripped of vegetation. Mudslides are frequent, especially in areas where trees once anchored the ground, but they've all been swept away or drowned in the floods. Even places that once seemed like sanctuaries have become dangerous, with the ground unstable and collapsing under the weight of waterlogged soil. Crops cannot grow in this saturated environment, so farming has become impossible. The global food supply, already pushed to its limits, failed long ago, and now people rely on whatever they can scavenge, hunt, or trade. Aquaculture is a rare exception. Those able to create makeshift fisheries in the flooded landscape may be able to survive longer, but resources are dwindling fast. The human element is one of desperation and adaptation. Large-scale governments no longer exist in their previous forms. Attempts at organizing relief efforts or managing the crisis broke down as the scope of the disaster grew beyond anyone's control. Society is fractured, with small groups of survivors banding together in isolated pockets, fighting for whatever resources they can find. In some places, order has been maintained by force. Strong leaders or militias controlling resources, doling out food and water in exchange for labor, allegiance, or worse. Elsewhere, anarchy reigns. Humanity's hope for a solution fades as each day of unceasing rain passes, and rumors of a brighter future, of salvation, are nothing more than whispers that no one believes anymore. Mental health has deteriorated as much as the physical world. The sight of the rain, once a novelty or a nuisance, now triggers anxiety and despair in people. The constant sound of it is maddening, a dull roar that never stops. There's no respite, no moment of peace or quiet, and the darkness has become part of life, sinking deep into the human psyche. People sleep fitfully, if at all, and many suffer from depression or worse. The sense of community has fractured for many, with survival now often prioritized over relationships or bonds that once held families and societies together. Trust is a rare currency in a world where everyone is trying to survive. Technology, which had once promised so much, is almost useless now. The internet, communication networks, satellites, all have been rendered obsolete by the floods. In the early days, people tried to cling to the hope that innovation would save them, that someone somewhere would find a solution to stop the rain or mitigate its effects. But as the years wore on, it became clear that there was no answer, no fix. Now, the remnants of technology are scavenged for parts, but the knowledge of how to repair or rebuild is slowly fading. Diseases have flourished in the damp, unrelenting environment. Clean water is almost impossible to find, and sanitation systems have broken down. Epidemics are common, spreading rapidly through the wet, unsanitary conditions. People live in fear of illness as much as they do of starvation. Medical supplies ran out years ago, and now, only the strongest or luckiest survive. Death is constant, whether from disease, drowning, or violence over the few remaining resources. By day 5,000, the human race is a fraction of what it once was, both in numbers and spirit. The rain, in all its monotony, has slowly worn down everything that made the world vibrant and alive. What little remains of human civilization is a shadow of its former self, hanging on by a thread in the face of an unrelenting deluge that shows no signs of stopping. Day 10,000. By the final day, 10,000 days into a world where rain has never stopped, the planet has become unrecognizable, a waterlogged husk where life clings on in fragments. Humanity is scattered and diminished, reduced to pockets of survival in an environment that no longer feels like Earth. The rain has sculpted the landscape into a desolate ocean with only the highest mountains peeking through as isolated islands. Any semblance of the world that once was, cities, forests, even deserts, has been submerged under countless meters of water. The pressure of the constant deluge has flattened or swept away most of the buildings that once stood, leaving behind only rusted remnants of human civilization beneath the endless expanse of water. Survivors live on makeshift rafts or scavenged boats, huddling in small, desperate communities where trust is rare, and survival is more about endurance than hope. The constant battle against the elements, soaking wet, cold, and hungry, has hardened people beyond recognition. On some rafts, people have lost the will to fight, merely drifting in aimless existence, their eyes glazed with the monotony of it all. Others have become feral, their humanity stripped away by the need to survive at any cost. Cannibalism is whispered about, though no one speaks of it openly. The once unthinkable has become a grim reality for those who can no longer find food in this drowned world. Food, that most basic need, is almost impossible to come by. Whatever aquatic life could be fished out of the endless waters has been hunted to near extinction. The oceans are largely dead zones now, devoid of fish, coral, or plant life. Desperation has forced people to rely on anything they can find: seaweed, small waterborne insects, or the occasional catch of some mutated, barely edible creature. Farming on the few pieces of floating land, if you can call it that, is rudimentary at best. Small crops of fast-growing, resilient plants are nurtured by the luckiest, but these scraps of green life are fiercely guarded and often stolen or destroyed by rival groups. Communication between these isolated human settlements is rare and sporadic. There's no centralized organization or authority anymore, no governments or networks to speak of. Any remaining technology has long since broken down, destroyed by the unrelenting moisture and lack of maintenance. Radios are silent, satellites have fallen from the sky, and the internet, if anyone even remembers it, has become a myth of a world long gone. Those with the skills to repair or rebuild such systems are either dead or too isolated to make a difference. The few signals that do get through are cryptic, offering little more than confirmation that others still exist, far off and just as desperate. The psychological toll on humanity is immeasurable. Those born after the rain started have never known anything else, and they look at the older generations with a kind of detached awe. Their parents' stories of sunlight, dry land, and cities seem like wild fables. For them, the rain is a constant presence, like gravity or the air they breathe. It's not something to be feared or questioned. It simply is. Yet this acceptance comes with its own form of despair. The younger generations have no dreams of a better world, no concept of a different life. They survive, but without purpose or ambition beyond the next meal, the next dry place to rest for a few hours. The older generations, those who remember the world before the rain, are a rare few. Their numbers dwindle by the day, either succumbing to disease, exhaustion, or the mental strain of living in a world that has taken everything from them. Some of them hold onto a flicker of hope, even now, but it's a faint, hollow thing. They tell stories of their children's children living in a future where the rain stops, where the world somehow heals, but even they don't believe it anymore. Mostly, they just want an end, some kind of resolution. Whether it's death, a miracle, or something in between, disease has wiped out vast swathes of the population. The rain has made sanitation impossible, turning every cut, every sickness, into a death sentence. The few who are left are either incredibly fortunate or have developed a grim expertise in self-care, scavenging for the last remnants of medical supplies or learning to treat wounds with whatever materials they can find. Plague-like illnesses sweep through the isolated communities from time to time, wiping out entire groups, leaving only a few survivors who move on to the next raft or outpost, hardened but diminished. There are no more organized religions or ideologies to speak of. Any faith that existed has been tested to the breaking point, leaving only a patchwork of personal beliefs, superstitions, and rituals that people cling to in the absence of meaning. Some whisper of divine punishment, of the rain as a never-ending flood meant to wash away humanity's sins. Others have embraced nihilism, seeing the rain as the final undoing of a world that was always teetering on the edge of collapse. On day 10,000, the human race is a mere flicker of what it once was. The rain has beaten down not just the earth, but the spirit of humanity itself. People are alive, but survival has become a routine, devoid of any real purpose or joy. The rain, constant and uncaring, continues to fall. The future, if there is one, lies in the hands of a few scattered souls, adrift in a vast, flooded world with no end in sight. The rain hasn't just drowned the planet. It has drowned hope, leaving behind a broken species that remembers the world as it once was, but has long since lost the will to reclaim it. As we reach the end of this journey through a world forever changed by endless rain, I want to thank you for sticking with us through every drop, flood, and storm. From the first day of rain to the distant future of a transformed planet, we've seen how nature and humanity would be reshaped by this relentless force. Hopefully, you've enjoyed imagining the possibilities and perhaps even learned something new about our own world along the way. If you found this exploration interesting, don't let it float away. Hit that like button, and if you're ready for more journeys through the unknown, subscribe to Quiet Universe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are plenty more mysteries waiting, and we'll be right here to dive into them with you. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay curious.